Grace and peace to you all. This is Lieutenant Roger McCourt from the Salvation Army in Napa, and I'm here today with our weekly worship and study. But I got to tell you, we're going to do things a little bit differently today than we usually do. Just kind of going in a slightly different direction. Now, first, you just need to know some stuff about me. I have always been tall. And thanks to good genes and education-obsessed parents and being part of a series of accelerated classes in elementary school, I occasionally demonstrated maturity beyond my years. Enough so that people often thought I was older than I was. Now, I tell you that just because, as a direct result of this, I started ministering to youth in 1983 at a summer vacation Bible school. And even though the leaders there had known me almost my entire life, I believe that the VBS directors thought I was more than 13. See, my job was to take groups of 8 to 12 elementary aged kids. If I remember right, there were 5 different groups. And I would spend 30 minutes with them each day of this VBS, teaching them how to play a game while I linked some kind of Bible story or devotional thought for the day to what it is we were doing. Now, I don't remember all the games, but I do know that we played Duck, Duck, Goose while considering the implications of Jesus choosing to save us while we still sat in our sin. Hopefully no one took that too seriously, or we have a whole bunch of people who grew up thinking that Jesus must just tap us on the head and then chase us around a circle, quacking. By the next year, I was a counselor at our denomination's summer camp. And from there, I went on to spend as much time as I could involved in youth ministry. And then after about 23 years, God sent me to focus on adults who, quite frankly, aren't really that different from kids. Now, when I began working with youth, I was trained to use the most effective ministry tools of the era. That included things like youth group ministry, or how to be a cabin counselor at camp when most cabins only had the one, kind of back in the day. And we were also trained to do lots of one-on-one private mentoring. We were encouraged to let each kid know that they were special by giving them lots of individual attention, or by pulling them aside to offer encouragement, or to involve them in a more personal relationship. One great way to reach a child, we were told, was to pay attention to what they needed or wanted, and then we would give them those gifts as kind of a direct outreach to draw them in. When speaking, we were told we should always touch the child you're speaking to, put a hand on an arm, or put an arm around their shoulder. We would play games like Honey If You Love Me, which involved having players seated in a circle while the person who was it would sit on someone's lap, look deeply into their eyes, and say, "Oh, honey, if you love me, won't you please, please smile?" And we would do that. We'd draw it out by making goofy faces, or sticking out your tongue, or speaking in exaggerated voices until it made them either laugh or you gave up on them and moved on to the next player. Or another game we would play is Sardines. Sardines was great. It was a reverse hide-and-seek game where the person who was it would hide, and then as each player found them, they would have to squeeze in beside them until every player but one was snarled together in that dark corner or storage closet or bunk bed. And we were taught discipline, how to use discipline, especially at camps and retreats. We were taught the best discipline was embarrassing or physically difficult challenges. So the kid would misbehave in the cabin, and you would say, "Okay, you need to run to the creek and back in your underwear," or "Go out and do knuckle push-ups in the gravel, 5 push-ups," stuff like that. And it was nothing mean-spirited or injurious. And usually we were taught these tools by people who would introduce the technique as being something milder than had been done to the generation before, when cruel pranks and corporal punishment were apparently commonplace. Now, if you've had anything to do with youth or youth ministry over the last 2 or 3 decades, you probably recoiled at one or more of those descriptions. And you should have. Over the last 40 years, the rules have changed dramatically. Well, they had to, because people realized these youth ministry tools were also being used by pedophiles to groom and manipulate their victims. And they were being used by abusers as a gateway to emotionally and physically damaging behaviors. Tools like the extreme examples that I cited, but also simpler things like a bear hug for a teen who just found out a friend committed suicide, or a quiet dinner alone with the kid that you wanted to check in on because they'd been so withdrawn all week. Or things like taking one of your junior leaders bowling by themselves, a reward for them stepping up to volunteer. Or activities like the leader who gets to be in the tent with the kids on a campout telling stories late into the night. See, for every abuser, there were 50,000 youth pastors who were just doing effective and loving ministry. And suddenly, we couldn't do what we did before because we needed at least one more adult for every activity because we were never allowed to be alone with kids. We weren't allowed to give hugs that we had been taught were necessary to show kids that they were loved. We were not allowed to play favorite games that had been played for generations. Not anymore. And that one-on-one mentoring that we had all been taught was absolutely essential, it had to stop. It was demoralizing. It felt like we were all being accused of behaving badly for excelling at good ministry. Usually the same ministry that had been used to reach us or our parents and their parents before them. And as a result of these changes, there were lots of meetings. And there were resignations. People who were sure they could no longer do their job because they were being kept away from the tools that they had always used. And then there were the terminations. People getting fired because they would not or could not change the habits of a lifetime in working with kids. Most youth leaders at this point were just certain this was another instance of lawyers gone crazy overboard and that it was going to pass and we would be allowed to go back to the way that things were. But it didn't. We weren't. And thank God. Instead, something unimaginable happened. It turned out there were other ways for us to do effective ministry. There were ways that were safer. There were ways that protected kids from abusers and protected youth workers from crossing over boundaries that they should never have been near in the first place. And yes, it felt different. In some ways, it seemed less personal. It seemed less relational. That's what we called all one-on-one ministry. We called it relational. Now, it was harder to do youth ministry at this point because we needed to check and reinvent everything we did. Can we play that game? We can't do that lock-in, or can we? How would it work? And it took a while, but it was necessary, so we did it. We changed. We tried new ways and new ministry, and we found we continued to be effective and relational, even though youth ministry in recent years looks very, very different than youth ministry did 40, 30, or even just 10 years ago. And now, thanks to the global pandemic, or at least our little piece of it, youth ministry has to change again. Adult ministry too. And it's hard and it's uncomfortable and people keep complaining that it's not the same as it has been. It feels different. And when can we just go back to the way things were? And the answer is never. And some things might go back, but there is no real chance we're going to just turn some corner and find ourselves right where we started. Change has happened. And the sooner that we accept and adapt to that change, the better. We need to think of this as it's an opportunity. We can try new things. We can find new ways. We can continue to be effective and relational. We really can. But it's okay to grieve the loss as long as you remember to look forward to the new life that follows. In fact, let me emphasize something you might have just missed there. It is okay to grieve. And as I watch the news coverage and I watch social media feeds, it just becomes more and more clear to me that we are grieving right now. A deep, corporately felt global grief. Some people are mourning the loss of a loved one or a favorite business, and some are feeling the heartache of lifestyle changes as they struggle with the loss or change of a job. Or maybe it's sadness brought on by not being able to spend time with a friend. Or maybe your sense of security has been unsettled by how quickly and voraciously an impersonal disease has destroyed everything that's normal, not just here, but around the world in nations of every political bent and every level of wealth. Or maybe it's just the misery you see around you, or the pain that others are experiencing that you can't stop. Or maybe it's your own pain that you don't feel like you can share because everyone else is already carrying their own. grief is funny. Grief is funny because it's been very well studied, and it has some distinct stages, and it's always presented as if it's going to be this nice, smooth curve from stage to stage until you reach the other end, all healed and ready to move on with your life. But the truth is, it may always start with a loss or a hurt that brings it on, but grief doesn't follow some nice, neat graph line of torment. Instead, it kind of careens through the options like a rabid wombat in your pants, sometimes taking more time to stage and sometimes less, and sometimes circling back to take us through the same stage again and again and again until it feels like an old friend. The five basic stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these stages affect individuals and communities, and they even affect agencies. One example of how this might happen can be seen in the way the recording industry handled itself over much of the last 2 decades. I promise, stick with me, this is going to connect. In the early part of this century, the recording industry, they became aware that the way they controlled artists and recordings and the media that we used to play those recordings on, those relationships had begun to change. And at first, the industry went into this state of denial. They did their best to ignore or discount the development of new technologies like the internet and MP3s and file sharing. And when it became obvious that they couldn't save themselves by just looking away, they began to exhibit fits of anger. They were lashing out at all those they thought were responsible. First, they sued large companies, places like Napster and LimeWire. And when that didn't help, they went after individuals. In fact, there were over 35,000 individual people sued, ranging from age 12 up. And the RIAA, they asserted that they had the right to destroy any or all data on the hard drives of anyone who dared to possess even one single MP3 knowingly or unknowingly. And eventually their anger and their legal funds all exhausted, they moved into a bargaining phase, trying to make deals that moved them into the field of making MP3s in an effort to meet customer demand. But that inevitably led to a depression as music stores like Tower and Warehouse went bankrupt and closed their doors. People stopped buying the other products, the CDs and the cassette tapes. Major recording labels merged, profits continued to drop. And finally, after far too long, the music industry began to look outside of themselves again, seeking new ways to profit from music sales. Once they reached this point of acceptance, they were willing and able to move on. And they started inking deals like Spotify and Pandora and all the streaming type medias and the like. And they began to market and produce vinyl records again and started selling performance rights. See, with acceptance came adaptation. And with adaptation came a new chance and a new life lived in a new, although completely changed, way. Are you with me? However grief has touched us, we need to recognize and acknowledge that it has. That's how we learn to make it a part of who we are so that we can move from the past that we long for through the present that we're stuck in on into the future. Don't believe me? Fine. I'm not trustworthy. I understand that. But this isn't from me. It's from Scripture. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 4 says, "Sages invest themselves in hurt and grieving. Fools waste their lives in fun and games." Now, that doesn't mean there's no benefit to fun or games. Obviously there is. But it does mean we need to acknowledge and explore grief. If you go back a couple of verses from that one, you'll see that it says you learn more at a funeral than you do at a feast. We're in that learning opportunity now. As of yesterday morning, Saturday morning, there have been 342,577 confirmed COVID-19 deaths worldwide. And if we haven't crossed over the 100,000 mark in the United States by the time you watch this video, we will in the next few hours. And around 1.7 million people are known to be infected. That's just in the U.S. And as this news and our sheltering in place have dominated the news cycle over the last few months, it is impossible for this virus not to have affected our collective consciousness even more effectively than it infected our physical bodies. And so we need to be aware of the grief and the loss that it has brought to each of us, so that we can gain wisdom from the experience and act in that acquired wisdom rather than just reacting mindlessly. A few years back, there was an author named Seth Trout who wrote a blog post where he explained the 5 stages of grief and how they meshed with a classic Christian book about coping with grief. It was written by a guy named C.S. Lewis. Most of you have probably heard of him. We're going to merge that further with my favorite book, the Bible, and we're going to use it as a guide to look at how these stages might be a part of the experience that we're going through right now. Now, I need to say this. Please remember that even though I'm examining these in what is called a typical order, there is no typical order, really. It may be more common to progress through these stages in a certain way, but some people go about them in whole different ways, and some take different amounts of time in different stages. That's just the way it is. And the most common stage people get into is denial, though a lot of people will deny that they're in it until they're not. Think that through. In that initial shock of change or loss, our first urge is often to just disbelieve that this can be happening. If we could just deny the reality, then we could deny the pain, right? And people turn to all kinds of things to try to push away the creeping fingers of loss that embed themselves into our souls. I mean, alcohol and drugs may be the obvious examples, but we may throw ourselves into other endeavors to avoid letting loss take hold. Or we might seek isolation, telling ourselves that we're alone. No one else could possibly understand what we're feeling. No one else could possibly ever know what we're going through. Which I suppose is true on one front, because all experience is inevitably unique. You are, of course, the only one who will ever be you. But at its core, this argument is flawed. That feeling of aloneness, that's universal. We all have moments where we are utterly convinced that we are alone. And in those very moments, we are experiencing exactly the same thing as every other person ever has. It's kind of the zeitgeist of humanity, except it transcends culture and time. We have all been there. We all know what it feels like. We really do. And we are capable of sharing the burden of your pain because we've been there. In Psalm 55, verses 4 through 8, the psalmist wrote, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me, and horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm." I confess I've had more than one day where I've thought, I just want to go run away to the desert. I love the desert. It's my peaceful place. But not something I get a chance to do very often, and not something I'm going to get a chance to do while we're in the middle of a pandemic, because we have more important things to do than pander to me. C.S. Lewis wrote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear." Moving forward is nearly impossible when we're living in fear and denial. The messages of fear surrounding us should be enough to tell everyone that the whole world we know is trapped in denial right now. It really is. There are indefinite plans to shelter in place and plans to open, even though not a single county in the United States has met even the lowest level of preparedness yet. There's fears that not wearing a mask outdoors means that any errant breeze is going to just waft the virus into you. And there's fears that wearing a mask is going to somehow harm your civil rights or keep you from getting oxygen into your lungs, and you're going to die, in spite of the fact that for decades, doctors and nurses have worn masks all day during their shifts. And there's conspiracy theories that, there is no virus, or that somehow it's a trick by a shadowy enemy or agency. Or there's a belief that this whole thing has been engineered by a political rival or by wealthy corporations or CEOs. These things are all part of denial. They're denying the facts. They're avoiding the truth. They're trying to get away from the situation rather than letting the raging torrent subside around you. And to get past denial, you need to sit with the facts. And by facts, I don't mean Facebook posts. And I don't mean one-sided rhetoric from whatever one favorite news source you have, but I mean actual facts. And you need to sit with them. Try to find facts that cover a lot of different perspectives and sit with them. In Jewish tradition, there's a practice when someone dies where the family of the deceased spend 7 days with the body before it's given a burial. It's called sitting Shiva. And it had two very specific purposes. It gave family and friends a chance to gather and to share in memories and in silence in presence of the dead. And after 7 days with the body, the awareness that the person was gone would become clear. And after 7 days of visitors, the fact that others are there with you sharing your pain should be just as obvious. That's the second reason that they did it. We know that this one is gone, and we know that these others are still here. So how do we sit Shiva while we're sheltering in place? Well, how about video chats? How about phone calls or a card or driving by the house of your favorite Salvation Army lieutenant and leaving an apple pie on his front step? Okay, maybe I threw that last one in. But you need to somehow figure out something you can do to reach out. And this is denial. How do we break out of the blocking that we're in? In the recovery world, there's a phrase, the first step is admitting there's a problem. And that's really the case here. Now, when you have acknowledged your denial and you've moved forward, the next stage is very often anger. And the anger phase is all about blame and where you want to put it. It is an unsettled resentment that just festers. Reflecting on his feelings after his wife's death, C.S. Lewis said, "What reason have we, except our own desperate wishes, to believe that God is, by any standard we can conceive, good? Doesn't all the prima facie evidence suggest exactly the opposite?" See, that was him speaking in anger. Now, anger can be uncomfortable, which often just makes us more angry. And it might not be rational. And you may know that it doesn't make sense even as you're experiencing it, but it's this white hot ball inside of you. It's just burning there, urging you to unleash it, to rage so that the whole world can see your hurt and feel your struggle. Job, early in the book that bears his name, screams out at God. He says, "I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the monster of the deep that you put me under guard? When I think my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, even then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that I prefer strangling and death rather than this body of mine. I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning." That's his anger and his anguish pouring out to God. In Psalms 22, verses 1 and 2, the psalmist laments, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? Why are you so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest." It's the same as with Job. It's this anger burning inside, pouring out, boiling over, getting flung at God. But anger is normal. Let me repeat that. Anger is normal. And God is open to you expressing your anger to him. Anger should never be stuffed down like it's going to disappear when you get it contained. We need to feel those feelings. We have to be honest about where they're coming from. Anger is always covering something that needs to be seen. So you need to find a safe person and share your anger, and you'll find that it gets easier to get at what's causing it as you share it. By the way, when I say you need to share your anger, I do not mean that you need to go post a rant on your social media site of choice. That is not sharing anger with someone you trust. That is using your anger as a weapon to try to cut at someone or something. That's anger breeding more anger. Infections need to be treated, not encouraged to fester in a gangrenous mass of pus. Now, as you pass into the stage of bargaining, it can feel a little bit like you're sliding towards denial again, because bargaining comes from this desire to go back to the way things were, or to control the future so that such things will never come again. We find ourselves saying things like, well, I will never feel that pain again if only I. Or maybe, what if I had just done this instead of having done that? So it's our attempt to take charge of potential pain so that we can direct events away from it. Bargaining is a reaction to our recognition that we're vulnerable. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just before he was arrested, knowing of this trial that was coming to face him and the crucifixion and all this, Jesus cried out to God. In Mark 14:36, he said, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet, not what I will, but what you will. See, some people preach that Jesus was happy to go to the cross to die for our sins, but I don't think so. He was distressed. Luke says that his stress level was so high he began to sweat drops of blood. Jesus asked God, could you just go another way? Please take this cup. Take it. Jesus understands the suffering that we feel when we struggle with feelings of this stage of grief. And so we can ask him for help because we know he understands. And when we ask him for help, then we too can come to the point that maybe we can say, not my will, Lord, but yours. That's our goal, right? And I wish that I could say that this would be the end of it, that we would clear through the bargaining stage and we would experience immediate and unending joy. But that's not what most of us do, really. Instead, at this point, most of us slide into a stage of depression. Why depression? Well, depression because your loved one isn't coming back. Because the math says that herd immunity will take a decade or more. Because you survived when others didn't. Because your megachurch will never be able to meet en masse the way they did before. Because a lot of things that you love have changed dramatically or even disappeared. Because Jesus didn't come back the way that you'd been hoping. Or maybe because you just don't know how to move on, or you don't feel right doing so. Or it could even be your reaction to realizing that you're grieving. Grief is depressing. It's dark, it's heavy, and it can stick to you and feel like you're never going to be able to get rid of it. C.S. Lewis wrote, I know that the thing I want is exactly the thing I can never get, because it is part of the past. And the past is the past, and that is what time means, and time itself is one more name for death, and heaven itself is a state where the former things have passed away. Depression. It isn't bad, though. I mean, not necessarily. It can be, if you allow it to plunge you into a sense of futility and you close yourself to the possibility of new creation. Some people do that. Sometimes a lot of people do that. If you look back in history to the 1920s, you'll see what that kind of futility can breed. Out of the widespread warfare of World War I, with its unimaginable killing fields and the destruction of cities and homes and farms and countries, came this pandemic as vicious and as deadly as any we had ever known. We called it Spanish flu, which is funny because it probably started in Kansas. But the Spanish flu, it started in 1918. And in 1918 and 1919, it infected 1/3 of the world's population, and it killed more than 50 million people. Possibly a lot more, as record keeping had really been devastated by the war in a lot of areas. What a bleak outlook that generation had after more than 6 years of death. Religious faith in Europe changed as people struggled to reconcile their view of God with the obviously broken world around them. Economies struggled to rebuild. They were spurred on by a new industrialism and a focus on consumerism, not on lasting values. Where people had trusted in institutions and traditions, they started to question the value that any of that had in a world where so many people, so many lives could be snuffed out so quickly. And the 20s roared into existence. People, especially younger people, sought to live for the moment and nothing more. And the rich got richer, and the poor got poorer. It was not a great time. We careened ever closer to the edge through that decade, right up until the stock market crashed and took the whole world with it. And this is depression sometimes. When it doesn't get addressed, when the underlying issues aren't faced and put to rest or incorporated into life, then depression mires us in its dark tentacles and pulls us into death. Other times, however, it becomes the catalyst for change. Those who recognize where they're going, who can see the depression for what it is, they can seek a different way. They can embrace change. They can allow themselves to receive help. And I feel like I need to say this. Please know I am focusing on depression that's born from grief. If you or someone you know is depressive because of chemical imbalances or other medical causes, then observation and treatment by a professional is required. And I urge you, please, be in regular contact with your provider so they can help you identify and respond to any changes in your health. But even this, too, could be said to be allowing yourself to receive help. But it really is just more good preventative medicine. You really need to stick to that. For the rest of us, and for those of you in medical depression, frankly, all of us, we need to resist isolation. We need to move out of the shame or hopelessness that we might feel, and we need to seek the warmth and understanding of others around us. And at that point, we should also remember God is there for us too. Psalm 69, verses 13 through 15, the psalmist says, I pray to you, Lord, in the time of your favor. In your great love, O God, answer me with your sure salvation. Rescue me from the mire. Do not let me sink. Deliver me from those who hate me, from the deep waters. Do not let the floodwaters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. We need to reach out to foster growth and emotional healing. Because when we do that, it moves us towards acceptance. And acceptance is usually the final stage. Now, arriving at acceptance doesn't mean that everything's all right and you're going to be perpetually happy. Frankly, what you've lost, what we have lost, will never be restored. In spite of popular misconceptions and the things that people tend to say without thinking, we don't ever get over the wounds that we receive in life. Instead, we learn to accept them. We learn to live around them, and we learn to integrate them into who we will be from this point forward. If you'll indulge me in one more quote from C.S. Lewis, he wrote, to say the patient is getting over it after an operation for appendicitis is one thing. After he's had his leg off, it's quite another. And then at some point after his wife's death, he said that something unexpected happened to him. He talked about a busy day followed by a solid night's sleep and waking to the sun shining and a light breeze, and how in that moment he found he was mourning her less, while at the same time remembering her more. And it's something I think we all need to remember here. It is never moving from your loss. It's about moving on with your loss. It's finding a new way to savor the memories of the loved ones who've gone before us. It's finding new ways to enjoy life that continues to happen around us. It's embracing new challenges and trying new things to find the joy that you can't get into in the old ways. Grieving is messy. And growing is messy, and change is messy, and that's because life is messy. But the future is hopeful. Revelation 21, verses 3 through 5, the author says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. And then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Sometimes, when the future that's near at hand is hard to see, looking ahead to the future that's coming can offer that little bit of extra encouragement that we need to get up and keep going. Because acceptance can take time, but God is always there with you. He's always waiting to go on with you into whatever it is that may come. God will always bless you with his love when you can accept it. He will always bless you with his mercy when you will allow it. Whatever your grieving experience has been like, don't give up. There's hope and there's renewed joy ahead, and neither of these betrays anything that's gone before, I promise. Better yet, God promises. One last verse to close our time. In Isaiah 43, verse 2, the Lord promises, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." That's a promise. I hope you'll pray this prayer with me as we close. Oh, Lord God, sometimes it seems like we are walking through the fire. Sometimes it looks like the flames will set us ablaze. There's so much going on around us that we don't understand, or that we think we understand and don't know why others see things differently. God, sometimes life hurts, and sometimes we're terrified of what's coming, and sometimes it's both, and we just don't know what to do. Oh, Lord, when the darkness comes down around us, remind us to hold on to the light. Help us to look for the truth even when we are in deep denial. When anger shakes us until we're ready to explode, help us to see and to share that rather than holding on to it or letting it go in a hurtful way. And as we try to bargain away our vulnerabilities in ways that will cut us off from future joys, just please, Lord, come alongside us and remind us that you know our struggle, and then lead us through it. And when the depression comes, those drops into the deep chasms of life which threaten to swallow us and seal us into the underworld forever, rescue us. Just show us the changes that we can make. Show us the ways that we can climb out of the pit. Show us the things we can do to move on without leaving anything important behind. God, help us to accept that grief is a part of this life, because death and loss are a part of this life. But help us also to follow you into that life where these things will be no more. Help us to put our faith in Jesus, who was willing to follow your will so that we could be saved, even in his own grief. We pray these things in his name. Amen. Amen. Grace and peace to you all this week. If you are lost in grief or suffering in other ways and you need someone to talk to, you can always reach out to me. You can find me here or on Facebook, or you can email roger.mccourt@usw.salvationarmy.org. And if that's not quick enough, or if you just don't want to talk to me, that is fine. The Salvation Army has a national emotional and spiritual care hotline available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. That number is 844-458-4673. Let me do that again. That is 844-458-HOPE. As always, your comments and questions are welcome. Please feel free to leave them below. And if you would be so kind as to click the like and subscribe buttons, we would be grateful. I would be grateful. Please know that you are blessed on your journey. Have a wonderful week.